When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject: They're calling me home. User: MythoHQ. Posted July 18th, 1996.
I work in healthcare, so I have a pretty realistic attitude toward death. If you're born, you're gonna die, and there's no getting around it. Everyone approaches death on their own terms, and I've seen every possible variation of that approach, from eagerness to acceptance to literally going kicking and screaming. Each time I ask myself how this compares to the way I'll finally go when the time comes, and I still don't really know. Maybe you can't know till it actually happens. The thing I'd never really thought about until recently is whether or not anything is waiting for you after you die. That might seem strange given how much death I see, but it has just never been part of my mental calculus. All that changed recently when I started hearing the screaming downstairs. Apart from the fact they had me working late, it was a normal shift. By 8 p.m., I had given everyone their evening medications and was parked at the nurse's station with Betty, who is part of the regular late shift rotation. Around 9:25, Dr. Parker stopped by to say hi before he went home, and I couldn't help but notice how chummy he and Betty were. When he left in the direction of orthopedics instead of going toward the elevator to parking, I knew exactly what was coming. Sure enough, 5 minutes later, Betty asked if I could hold down the fort for half an hour, and when I said yes, walked off in the same direction as the good doctor. Hey, they're adults. They're free to make whatever choices they want. I'm just grateful she didn't try to lie to me. Betty was actually gone for 45 minutes, so good for her, I guess. When she got back, I gave her a quick status update and decided to go down to the cafeteria for a coffee. The cafe at Piedmont usually closes at 7, but night shift has a key to the kitchen, so we can keep ourselves caffeinated. I know they keep pushing to just put a damn machine upstairs, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. That's hospital bureaucracy for you. The kitchen is your standard industrial setup with a big urn that remains perpetually brewing like the eternal flame at Kennedy's grave. The only light in the entire room was an orange glow cast by the urn's on switch, and I moved toward it. I was halfway through filling up a mug when, out of nowhere, I heard a blood-curdling scream. It reverberated through the entire room at a volume so loud it hurt. It startled me so badly, I dropped the mug I had been filling, splashing hot coffee all over my nice new shoes, and I felt it sting against my legs and feet. After 2 or 3 seconds tops, the screaming cut off, like someone had unplugged a speaker, and all I could think was that Betty, or one of the patients, was in trouble. I barreled out of that kitchen at what felt like 100 miles an hour, taking the stairs 2 at a time. I crashed through the second floor door and watched in real time as Betty jumped about a foot in the air. I must have looked out of my mind because she asked me what was wrong. I told her about the scream and said I thought she was in trouble, but she shook her head. It hadn't been her or anyone on the ward. In fact, she hadn't even heard it. Together, we called security, and Rob, the night guy, came to see us. Apparently, he hadn't heard anything either, and after we'd called, he'd done a walkthrough of the hospital. Everything was quiet and in its place, he said, before telling us to keep in touch should we hear anything else. After Rob left, I genuinely started to worry about my sanity. I had heard what I'd heard, but if there was no obvious cause, maybe I needed to look for medical explanations. It happened again the night after next, disproving my medical hypothesis. The lead up to it was the same, right down to Betty and Dr. Parker consulting in the empty orthopedics room. This time, the scream rang out just as I entered the kitchen, so powerful it made the pots and pans hanging from the ceiling shake. It still cut right through me, but this time I didn't panic. Instead, once it was over, I walked to the coffee urn as calmly as possible and, with shaking hands, poured myself a cup. Steam rose off the surface of the liquid, much more than there should have been, and I realized the temperature had dropped significantly. Was this new? I wondered. Or had it happened last time too, but I'd missed it by running away. I came upstairs to find the total opposite of what had happened last time. Instead of Betty sitting at the nurse's station, I heard her voice coming from room 15. Room 15 was home to a patient I'll call Mr. Stamos, a cardiac patient whose recovery had seemed to be coming along nicely. Long story short, that night he had a series of heart attacks and we lost him. He said something to me before coding for the final time, and though I've rotated back to day shift, it's still rattling around in my head. It's not uncommon for patients undergoing heart failure to cough up blood. It's part of the process you don't see when they show it in movies, and Mr. Stamos was expectorating a lot of it. After coughing up one last lungful of fine red spray, he looked at me and said, "I heard their song. They called me home." These were his final words. Now, I'm left to ask myself, what did he mean? I know patients sometimes say strange things before they're passing, but that's usually hypoxia, end-of-life medication, or a combination of the two. Maybe I'd have felt the same about what he said if I hadn't had those two experiences in the kitchen, but I did have them. Were those screams the song he was talking about? Is there something out there that calls us when our time is done? What I heard was not comforting in any way, but I can't help but think about my maternal grandfather. He was Polish and preferred to speak his native language, and as a child I never got used to the sound. Even though he was an even-tempered man, something about the sound of the language frightened me. Is it possible what I heard as horrifying screams sound differently to the dying? That their comprehension expands as they get closer to the end? Or was it all a big coincidence and I'm spending way too much time focusing on something that shouldn't merit more than a moment's thought? I really don't know.
Subject, Itsy Bitsy Spider. User, Waitsetter. Posted, June 12, 1997.
My family is pretty used to what you might call unexplainable things. My mom and her siblings always tell stories about their childhood home being haunted, but something happened in our basement last week that defies any explanation I come up with. I'd heard of ghosts. I'd heard of shadows that move like people, but I'd never in my life heard of shadows that move like spiders. My wife Mel and I just bought a new house in Hazel Green, maybe 15 miles outside of Huntsville, Alabama. We both work in the city, but we wanted to live somewhere quiet where our money went further and where we could raise kids should we so decide. Hazel Green is all that and more. Like I said, once we were properly moved in, we threw a party for our friends and neighbors, sort of a little get-to-know-you type thing. We've done that a couple times when we moved, and it works wonders for endearing yourself to the neighborhood. It might sound crazy, but you never know when you're going to need the people around you, and you're better off being on their good side. The party wasn't anything crazy. Maybe 25 people total at its busiest point. Snacks, beer, wine, and then whiskey once the crowd thinned out. It was shortly after we broke out that whiskey that Mel spotted the spider. Before anyone suggests the whiskey had anything to do with what we saw next, let me say that we've consumed enough whiskey both separately and apart to become experts on what it does and does not do to you. It does get you drunk, maybe make you want to fight a little. What it does not do is make you see things. Bear that in mind as I go forward. As I said, the party was winding down, and the 6 people who were left, including Mel and myself, moved our big old U-shaped sofa in the basement with a bottle of Old Grandad and a Parcheesi board. We were only a couple moves in before Mel grabbed my arm. "Jimmy," she said, pointing up toward the ceiling, "you're up." "You're up" meant she'd seen a spider. It was my job to get rid of them. I'm varmint patrol, and she clears out the gunk at the bottom of the sink. It's a good division of labor. Everyone looked to where she was pointing, but couldn't see what she was talking about. Morris, one of the new neighbors, asked what he was looking for. Mel told him spider, just as his wife Jill said, "Oh, I see it. I don't think that's a spider." Mel looked insulted. She's absolutely terrified of spiders and can spot one the size of a button from 200 yards away, so I believed her. A moment later, I spotted it too, a small black dot hanging from the ceiling, and stood up to do my duties as pest control, only to find myself thinking, Jill might be right. Spider wasn't that, or a bug of any kind. Instead, it looked like a teardrop-shaped blot of ink or oil, and it wasn't hanging from anything. It was just suspended there in the air above us. "Mel," I said, "that's not a spider." She did not like me taking Jill's side and tried to fight me on it, but then I waved my hands all around the thing, showing it wasn't connected to any web or filament. Herb, another one of the remaining guests, piped up and said, "Well, then what the hell is it?" I shrugged. Morris got up to get closer to look at it, standing next to me and peering at the tiny black drop. He reached out to touch it, and Jill shouted, "Morris, have you lost your mind? Leave it alone." His hand snapped back like he'd been electrocuted. The air had gone totally silent, all 6 of us focused on this insignificant little blob hanging between us. For a second, I thought back to county fairs when I was a kid, how people used to be absolutely terrified by wasps. My sister and I always laughed at how one tiny wasp could herd packs of adults back and forth across the midway. Now here, 6 adults were in complete thrall to something that wouldn't even be a respectable dot on the carpet. I tried blowing on it to see if I could push it with air pressure, but instead of moving it, it just rippled. Mel, who I assume had now been convinced we weren't dealing with any kind of insect, suggested we just leave it alone and sit back down. The Parcheesi board didn't get any more play that night, though, because even sitting down, we couldn't take our eyes off of our visitor. Eventually, through no action of our own, almost like it was making its own decisions, the blob floated away from us and disappeared from view with a tiny popping sound. After it was gone, I expected everyone to climb over one another in a mad dash to escape the basement, but instead, Morris broke the ice. Jimmy, the answer to this is either more whiskey or less, and it's too late for less, so. He held up his glass and everyone laughed. After that, we got down to finishing that bottle of Old Grandad and worked our way through a few other things I had in the liquor cabinet. Everyone, it turned out, had their own weird story. Not black blob floating midair weird, but we talked about haunted houses, phone calls from dead people, and a whole lot more till the sun started to come up. The whole thing turned out to be our best housewarming party ever.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.